Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. This is a Q&A session. So these are questions that have been sent in by my members over on Substack and also on Patreon. So a big thank you for, again, another great list of questions. We'll get through as many as possible. And this one will be split into two, as always. So the first part is available to everybody, but the second part is available only to members. And that's where we get into some of the questions related to investing and wealth preservation. So if you do enjoy part number one, please consider becoming a member and listening to part number two with the community. Okay, let's get into it. The first question is a fantastic question. It was sent in by Bridget, and she says, a question that comes to mind is, how has this everything bubble still not deflated? What sort of magic is happening behind the scenes? In the US, I see stress, tension, except in the top 10% who appear quite content. But I know that access to credit is still a factor, but still the numbers don't add up. I remind myself that depression is not just economic, it is a mental and emotional state as well, and I can feel it in the atmosphere. You know, I think you speak for a lot of us there, Bridget, when you say that, because it's actually quite unbelievable. It's staggering. The scale of the fraud that is happening to keep this financial system afloat. When you think about how long they've managed to do this and how many times they've kicked that can, it is actually quite extraordinary. They deserve some credit for that. And pardon the pun, because credit is the key word here. It is a system of creditism. They are just expanding bubble after bubble and inflating them ever greater, because they know that if they deflate one of these bubbles, the whole pack of cards comes crashing down, because these markets are not made on human labor. They're not made on real growth. They're made on the growth of money supply, or should we say currency supply. And so the system's warped out of shape. Obviously, it's enriched, as you said, the top 10%. So you could say that the people who were brought up in maybe the 70s and 80s, the boomers, yeah, they've got some money stacked away, so they're okay. But above them, there is, of course, the 0.1%, and those people have absolutely looted this system. And the reason they've done that is to accumulate not just massive amounts of real assets and possessions, because that's what they do. They have the digits go up so fast, they get very close to that creation of new currency, and then they convert it to real assets and they consume business, industry, land. And of course, they build out the military industrial complex, they control politics, they bribe people. And so this is about accumulating not just wealth, but power also. And they understand that the more power they accumulate, if they get to a critical mass, then eventually maybe they could create some kind of mark of the beast system where everybody is forced to do whatever they say through totalitarian diktat. And that's really the long arc of history. And if you go back to the Bible, that is the story. That is what they say we will eventually get to. You'll have this group which the Bible calls a satanic, that these people work for evil. They pretend to be one thing, but they're not. And eventually they get complete control. And actually, if you look around right now, yeah, it does feel like we're close. So that's why they want to keep this going, because they know that they're almost over the finish line. But when you think about it, it is, yeah, pretty amazing that they've managed to do it. And obviously, at any point, this could come crashing down. Right now, we've got a banking sector that is completely insolvent. The scale of the insolvencies are going to be worse than 1929 because of all the unrealized losses on the bank's balance sheet. Similarly, we've got a worse stock market bubble than the year 2000. If you look at the Buffett indicator in the year 2000, just going into the dot-com crash, the US stock market was valued at around 140, 150% of GDP. So that was the multiple of American gross domestic product. Today, it's over 250. In fact, if we had a stock market crash to the same amount that we saw in 2000, it would only bring us back on the Buffett ratio to where we was going into the dot-com crash. That's how obscene the bubble is. Then we could look at the credit bubble. The credit bubble is, of course, grotesque. It's worse than 2008, and they have had to do this. These exotic tools they was using, taking interest rates to 5,000-year lows to extend this bubble, and then flooding the system with currency after currency after currency print. And then, of course, that started to get exhausted. That was no longer working. It's inflated these nominal asset price bubbles, but they're destroying the currencies. They've wreaked havoc and destroyed the real economy. Global debt is at 350 trillion. They've created this massive hyper financialized system with 2 to 4 quadrillion in derivatives. When this thing comes down, it's like a nuclear bomb going off in every country all at once. So it's going to be a catastrophe. And that could happen at any point. It does seem like we're very close now. That's why we're living now through this era of rolling crisis. It's crisis after crisis because that's the only way they can perpetuate this system and do the things they need to do to keep these bubbles going, to keep them inflated. Because, like I said, if one of them goes, the whole system goes. So that's why we saw COVID. It was to print an obscene amount of credit. Now, of course, it's not just about that. They're also using this as a reset. They've architected a new system that's a digital financial surveillance panopticon, and that's what they want to put you into, and that's why they are desperate to keep this going just long enough to push us all into that. And what are we seeing right now in America? The Clarity Act, the Genius Act, stable coins being mainlined right into the financial system, tokenization now in 2026. That's the big thing for the DTCC, is to start tokenizing all the assets. So yeah, that is where we're at. And if you look at the debt of nations, of course, this had to end at some point. That's why I don't think these people who say, oh, well, they'll just keep bailing out the system, that's impossible. You've got US debt to GDP at 125%, projected to be 600% by the end of the century. Just saying that is absolutely outrageous and ridiculous. I feel ridiculous saying that. Debt to GDP of 600%. I don't think we get there. They're going to have to do a hard stop at some point. And that is what I think they're planning for. I think they understand that this can't go on forever. So they're playing for all the marbles this time. That's why the Great Taking exists. And the economic depression that they're going to create, that they've already created, because I think we're already in a massive economic depression. It's just been masked over. But if you look at the real economy, I was discussing just today with someone, the University of Michigan Sentiment Indicator, which is looking at consumer sentiment, just got the worst readout in history. And so when you're seeing these things, you can see that depression is already here. And as you rightly point out, it's not just an economic state, it's a social and psychological state too. And I think the next depression is going to be far worse than the Great Depression. And you will see a lot of people psychologically break. And I think that's part of it. And there will probably be an ensuing crisis that captures the masses' minds, because otherwise they're going to point fingers at who did this to us. And of course, you could have social revolutions and uprisings. But I think they're very good, as we saw during COVID, at controlling the psychological states of people and giving them narratives and getting them to believe in things that, quite simply, for most of us guys, are unbelievable. But they're going to need to do that during this ensuing crisis to get people into this digital system. When people wake up and they find out that, their bank deposits are gone, their pension, that they've worked their entire lives for, slaving hard for, thinking, well, one day I'll get to retire, I can enjoy my retirement with the grandkids, play some golf, that all of that was just a fantasy. It was an illusion. And then the hangover sets in and you'll have lots of very angry people. And of course, these parasites who create this usurious system, they don't want that anger directed at them. So they're going to turn it back inwards, either on themselves or onto society in general. So I think we're very close now, and we're in that phase of the reset where crisis just has to be constant, distractions have to be constant, psyops and gaslighting has to be constant. Otherwise, people will figure out what's going on, they'll realize, and then they'll rush out the system and start to take emergency evasive action, which is what I advocate people do, is to start taking action, because these periods of history are diabolical and we're in it. We're deep into it now. And if you haven't figured that out yet, then I don't know what to say. Just look around at what's going on. Okay, on to the next question. That was a great one. Thank you, Bridget. It's, hi, Mike. Regarding the mining stocks and commodities, given how these sectors play out over a long period of time, do you think that it's possible that by the time this cycle is over, gains could be trapped into a digital currency system, thereby preventing any profit rotation into physical metals? Well, I think absolutely people could wind up trapped in the coming crisis. I've said this many times. We're coming to the end of a debt super cycle. We've got quadrillions in paper derivatives, 350 trillion in global debt. There's only around 150 trillion of assets, and I'm talking all of the commodities, all of the real estate, all of the hyperinflated stocks and bonds, all of it only comes up to around 150 trillion. So the maths don't add up. And the real money of the system at current prices, gold, there's around 14 trillion in the world. So yeah, either gold has to hyperinflate to accommodate for all of that, or all of that comes crashing down. And of course, gold would buy you a lot more of that. So that's where we are. And it's quite likely because of that reason, they're going to go for a hard reset. So they've got no options. They're trapped in their own creation. They have hubris to the gills. They think they're going to be able to ride this one out. I don't. I don't think they're going to succeed in what they're planning. I think it's going to be a real implosion where they try to force through something that's impossible. And so then you'll have something that looks like the collapse of the Soviet Empire times 1,000. And that's what I'm more worried about and preparing for in terms of my own life. So yeah, they can absolutely trap people in. That's probably the plan. That's what you can do with a financialized system that's digital. And even in the current system, they can freeze you out of your bank account. That's very easy to do. In fact, I'm hearing stories right now all the time of people that are being told, no, you can't have your money back. We are freezing your account. Or if you want to withdraw $2,000, you have to come into the bank and apply for it and tell us and give us evidence or proof as to what you're going to spend it on. So absolutely, that is the point. In the 1929 stock market crash, as the bank failures began in the years that followed, obviously people were going to the physical bank and taking their money out, and that was collapsing the banks. They don't want that to happen this time. That's why they've set up for bank bail-ins, which means they'll just freeze your account, empty it of all of the currency, because as soon as you put it in a bank, it's no longer yours. Legally speaking, you've loaned the bank the money. So at that point, they can take it and default on you, and it will go to the bank, or it will go to the bank's creditors. And that's what they're going to do. Obviously, the same thing can happen with your retirement account or 401ks. You don't own those assets. You simply own a subordinated claim to them, and they're being used as collateral without your consent. And in fact, they don't need your consent because it's not your assets any longer. That's what they did when they dematerialized these assets. They started to put them in street name at the DTCC, and now they legally own the assets and you've just got a claim to it. So the system's being rigged so that when the reset does in fact happen, if you think a reset is going to happen, they can just hit the button, freeze everyone out. Everyone's left with paper claims and they've got the real wealth and they take it. And then at that point, we don't know what happens. Now, that's not to say that with a good structured portfolio right now, you couldn't still have some exposure to equities. I use something called a wealth preservation pyramid that I created that is about being able to invest strategically during these difficult times in history. Why would you want to do that? Well, because there is no safe way through this. There's only ways of mitigating risk and spreading it out. And so when we go through these resets, there are huge opportunities along the way. We've already seen some of them. We've seen some asset classes go up, like gold, for example, 70% in a year. If you wasn't there for that, if you wasn't properly allocated to gold, and in my wealth preservation pyramid, the very bottom layer, the biggest layer is physical gold. So people who were allocated properly to that saw those benefits. Those who were not, those who thought a portfolio of just the S&P 500 and bonds was the best, well, guess what? Last year, you got 15%, but the dollar lost 15%, so you got nothing. And so that's what you need to do during these times. Understand how this is going to play out. Look at past cycles. Position yourself properly. Definitely need to be strategic. There are opportunities in commodities and gold and silver miners, but at some point they can just close that door. So you have to be confident that you can get in and out of the markets, take profits and convert it into real assets. Otherwise you could be trapped. And, I think in the next system, it's very unlikely that we have public markets in anywhere near the same way that we do today. Today, we've got the stock markets and people can buy shares in companies. Well, if you wipe out the wealth of the majority of the population and you take all of those shares and you own all the companies and all the assets, well, you're going to end up with something more like Soviet Russia, where the state, or should we say the people above the state controlling it, own most of the assets. It's going to be a lot like fascism. It's going to be like Mussolini said, fascism should be more appropriately called corporatism, because it's when the state and the corporations are entwined. Well, that is precisely the public-private partnership that the World Economic Forum are pushing for and have been implementing in all of our nations for a long time. And we're actually seeing it take place. America, we saw them take a stake in IBM last year. They're taking stakes in companies. China's already doing this. So the public-private partnership, which really is just a form of fascism, already exists. That's why you've got Palantir being given massive amounts of government contracts. Donald Trump last year gave Palantir the surveillance capabilities over all of your data, all of your health records, and they're being funded entirely by government contracts. It's the same with Tesla. It's the same with Oracle. They're all in bed with the government. So it already exists, but I think in the next system, it will be completely that way because nobody in the plebeian class will have any wealth to invest in these companies. So it will all be controlled by digital currencies, by a top-down approach. And that's where I think we're heading to. And you can see it being set up for already. Okay, on to the next question. Hi, Mike. What do you look for in the physical silver and gold markets and the miners and as indicators that would tell you we're close to a probable bottom to warrant scaling back into a few well-chosen miners? Well, ultimately, I'm a macro investor, so I'm trying to make sense of the world and I'm trying to be discerning, and I have to be more discerning than the average person. I've got to be more discerning than the contrarians because if you believed, for example, in 2025 that Donald Trump was here to save America and Main Street, well, you shut the bed on that one. It didn't happen. In fact, Main Street is bleeding right now. Inflation's high. So you've got to be able to see through the narratives and try and figure out what comes next. And that's what I try to do as a macro investor. And as I always say, some narratives are bigger than others. So yes, gold and silver are going to rise. Yes, they're important assets. But if you go into the miners and we have a major meltdown in the stock market, and don't forget, the stock market is at the most overvalued records in history. It's never been so overvalued. When that thing starts to unwind, and it's going to unwind because when liquidity dries up, that's what happens. The moment liquidity starts to pull back from the system or literally just stays flat, the whole thing starts to collapse. That's the problem with a debt-based system. You need continuous amounts of debt, greater infusions of debt just to keep the thing going. And right now we're seeing liquidity stress across the system. That's why things are selling off. It's also why we saw the repo market being drawn down all December, in January, in February, biggest drawdown since the COVID crash. So that's telling us that a crisis is needed to perpetuate the system further, and then cometh the hour, cometh the man. The Iran crisis emerges. Now, I was already exiting stage left when I saw this because I thought, well, they're going to need another crisis and another huge liquidity injection if they in fact are going to save the system, because maybe they pull the rug. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is the one that takes us all the way to the end and they're just going to trap everyone in, as our previous community member said in that question. So yeah, liquidity is key, and that narrative could destroy all of your portfolio. If you've got a portfolio full of miners, they could be the best companies on planet Earth. They could be fantastic mines with great management teams. It doesn't matter in that moment, because in a Ponzi scheme, when it starts to unwind, everything gets sold simultaneously. And we actually saw this a little bit in gold the last few months. Well, let's say the last few weeks, but the last month or so, as gold started to sell off because of the panic in the Strait of Hormuz. Everything was selling, by the way. It's not just gold. People who tell you that are giving you a false impression. But we did see everything start to sell off simultaneously as people rushed for liquidity. And in the early stages of a crisis, that's what happens. And it would be the same if this stock market does start to unwind. And unless they flood it with currency again, and it's going to have to be way bigger than 2020, then that will happen. So I am too nervous right now to be exposing myself to miners too much or anything like that. I own a few companies, some fertilizer companies. I've got a little bit of exposure to pipeline companies, an oil company, but I'm fully aware that if this thing unravels, they're going to go down too. So I'm mainly positioned for that, so I can buy things when they're much cheaper, or simply not, because we don't know how this unfolds. So I'm watching, I'm waiting. And so I would be careful. And when do you know it's bottomed? Well, you know it's bottomed when the Ponzi system has unwound. And if it hasn't unwound, then what you're waiting for is for the bailout. Otherwise, you have to think the downward pressure is way higher than any potential uplift, because liquidity is drying up. That's the simple fact. Okay, on to the next one. Somebody said, raising a family on one income here in the US, we received our 2025 income tax bill today, and the amount we owe the parasitic government for 2025 has quadrupled, yet my husband's salary has not highway robbery? This is a great question. Our investments are in the S&P Ponzi market. If we get out before the reset, how, where, what should we invest in besides gold, silver, and precious metals? Any advice is greatly appreciated. Well, of course, not financial advice. Please do your own due diligence. But for me, besides gold and silver, I would be thinking about land. I would be thinking about land and other real assets that are not heavily exposed to this coming credit collapse. Once the banking sector fails, remember, in the 1929 stock market crash, when the banks failed, many people lost their family farms and houses, not because they couldn't afford to pay their mortgage, but because they couldn't refinance, because the credit system collapsed. When a credit system collapses, everything collapses. Our entire economy is run on debt. Every wholesaler, every haulage company, every logistics firm, everybody requires rolling credit. When this banking sector comes down, that disappears. So everything fails simultaneously, and individuals fail. They can't afford to reservice their debt, their car loans, their credit cards, their mortgages. And that's when you see people lose their houses. So, besides gold and silver, I would be looking for assets that are not heavily exposed to credit, that are not in massive credit bubbles. And land is actually one of them. Lots of people buy property like real estate with credit, and they buy commercial real estate, but not land, not so much. So I would say, yes, land's a good one. It's got many positives with land. It can certainly fall in value. I'm not saying that, but it's actually gone up tremendously in the last decade because, like gold, it can't be printed. Assets that can't be printed are the ones that you want to be focusing on going into the collapse of a hyperbubble, of an insane hyperbubble like the one we've got now. So I like land. It can't be printed. It can be used to grow food. So it's an income-bearing asset. You can harvest trees. You can live off the land, of course, if you really have to. So it's a great alternative investment. And in many ways, it's just a better and safer store of wealth than a financialized asset. It's definitely better than owning, bonds, for example, which are just certificates of confiscation. The stock market, you have to be pretty nifty, get in and out, be strategic, and still you're exposed to the great taking, you're exposed to risk. So unless you are doing that with competency and with a few strings in your bow, then I would say land is another asset that is probably going to be safer. And it's going to be there no matter what. And obviously, if you pay for it without debt, then fantastic, you own it. What else? Outside of that, I'd say anything that you need to survive harder times. Get yourself a reliable vehicle if you haven't got one yet. That's a really smart thing to do. A food store, a really good pantry, fill that thing out so that you don't have to worry about it. If hard times come and you can feed your family for at least a year, you're going to be okay. You're going to come up with solutions in that year. You're not going to be panicked and stressed. You're not going to have to jump into some kind of social credit system if that's what they say you need to do to get your hands on some tokens to buy some food. Backup energy, that's another fantastic thing to have. Some backup energy. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can be a portable solar generator. Those things will last a decade. Get yourself a well if you don't have one yet. Of course, if you're not on the land, maybe you could consider doing that with your wealth, selling what you've got and going somewhere more suitable for the time period we're going into. Remember, we've lived in ways that were aberrations historically. Historically speaking, during the harder times, most people lived on a farm. 1 in 3 people during the Great Depression. Today, it's like 1 in 100. And those farms are not useful anyways. They don't have rows of vegetables and different types of vegetables and crops and orchards and animals like chickens and fowl and cows for milk. No, these farms are just fields and fields of the same monoculture crop. So you're not going to survive on those things. And so it's really going to be pretty difficult when this one comes down. Right now, we're seeing fertilizer being taken offline. 50% of the world's food supply depends on fertilizer that comes down the Strait of Hormuz, or used to come down the Strait of Hormuz. You've got the oil shock and the energy shock. Farmers are saying, well, we're not able to plant. We can't afford to. Look at Ireland right now. The farmers are out protesting. They were blocking the roads. The military and the masked Stasi police have been sent in, and the pepper spraying granny and beating old men up with sticks. It's a nightmare. And this is going to get worse. This social unrest is only just beginning. That's what they've set up all of these sleeper cells of strange people in all of our Western countries for, is to create chaos. Because when this thing comes down, you need to be distracted. You need to be looking elsewhere because they don't want you to realize what's actually happening. So I think getting yourself to a safer location, getting yourself the things you need to survive harder times, that is the best investment. Gold and silver is for excess wealth, really. So I would think about that. It will improve everything. Go to a homestead, it improves your finances first and foremost because you're not exposed to the rising costs. Energy costs are very cheap if you've got backup energy or you're using solar. Obviously, if you've got a well, you're not using the water company. In my house at night, we use candles, so we're really old-fashioned over here. It improves your quality of life. You're eating healthier food. You're not having to pay for food. It improves your mental health because you're out in nature a lot, working on the farm. Obviously, you can heat your house off grid too, so you don't have to worry about the whole thing going down and freezing to death in winter. And then your family's happy. Your family's closer together on a farm. We have intergenerational living. We have parents coming. We've got new generations coming up, and that's a beautiful thing. And so, yeah, I think everything starts from the homestead. And I've got a fantastic article on this called the Citadel Strategy. And I say in that the first thing you need to figure out is your own resiliency psychologically, and second is the homestead. Everything else is built on top of that. So that's what I'd focus on. In closing, I think we're going to pause there for the end of part one. I've got plenty more questions, especially ones on gold and silver, surviving the reset, what skills will be in demand for part number two. So some great questions coming up. So if you're not a member yet, please consider becoming a member. I put out a lot of members content. It really does support me and the channel as well. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. And members, I'll see you in part number two.